Albert, can you hear me?
Hey! Who are you? Where am I?
You are still here, but not quite where you think. Something's wrong, isn't it? You can feel it, can't you?
It's all frozen. I tried to fix it, but something went wrong. Everything stopped. Who are you? Why can't I see you?
Let's just say I'm an observer. And you, Albert, have done something extraordinary. But now, you need to understand how it all happened.
I don't know if I can explain it. It's all so twisted, so wrong.
Start from the beginning, Albert. Tell me everything. Perhaps in the telling, you'll find the answers you seek.
Albert takes a deep breath, his mind racing back to the start of the experiment.
It all began with the flux core, the experiment that was supposed to change everything.
Albert stood in the cold, sterile lab, surrounded by towering machines that hummed with barely contained power. The flux core, a massive cylindrical device at the center of the room, pulsed with an eerie blue light, casting long shadows across the floor. Albert's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of excitement and dread. This was the culmination of years of research. Project Flux, a groundbreaking experiment that could change the very fabric of time. He glanced at the monitor in front of him, the data streaming across the screen in rapid succession. Everything was ready, the calculations precise, the equipment primed. But there was a nagging doubt in the back of his mind, a whisper of uncertainty that he couldn't quite shake. "Are you sure about this?" came the voice of Dr. Julia Carter, his colleague and close friend. She stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the flux core, her expression tense. Albert nodded, though his own doubts mirrored hers. "We've run the simulations dozens of times. It should work." "Should," Julia repeated, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "But this is time we're dealing with. One mistake, and—" "I know," Albert interrupted, his voice more forceful than he intended. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "But we've come too far to turn back now." Julia studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "All right. Let's do this." Albert's hand hovered over the control panel for a moment, his mind racing through all the possibilities, both the triumphs and the catastrophes. Then, with a final, resolute breath, he pressed the button. The flux core roared to life, the blue light intensifying as the machine's inner mechanisms spun faster and faster. The air around them seemed to vibrate, the very fabric of reality bending and warping under the strain. Albert's eyes were locked on the screen, his heart in his throat as the data began to shift. But something was wrong. The numbers didn't align, the readings were off, and before he could react, the flux core emitted a high-pitched whine. "Shut it down!" Julia yelled, but it was too late. The machine exploded with a blinding flash of light, and Albert felt himself being torn apart, his very being stretched across time and space. When the light faded, Albert found himself lying on the cold floor of the lab, the smell of burning electronics filling the air. He groaned, his body aching as he pushed himself up. The lab was in ruins, the equipment shattered, and the flux core was a smoldering wreck. But that wasn't the worst of it. As Albert staggered to his feet, he realized something was terribly, horribly wrong. The world around him was different. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling as if they had aged decades in mere moments. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "Julia," he called out, but there was no answer. Panic surged through him as he searched the lab, but Julia was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished, erased from existence. Albert's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had the experiment gone wrong? Had they torn a hole in time itself? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint whisper, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down his spine. Albert. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty lab. Albert. He clutched his head, his heart pounding. The voice was familiar, painfully so. It was his mother's voice, but twisted, distorted, as if coming from a place beyond reality. "Mom," he whispered, fear gripping him. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, and for a brief moment he saw her, his mother, standing in the corner of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Albert, help me," she pleaded, her voice weak and filled with pain. Albert's blood ran cold. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mother was safe at home, miles away from this place. But the image before him was so vivid, so real, it was impossible to dismiss. He took a step forward, but the vision of his mother flickered, like a glitch in a video, and then she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. "No!" Albert cried, rushing to the spot where she had stood, but there was nothing there. The lab was silent once more, the only sound his ragged breathing. Albert sank to his knees, his mind reeling. The experiment had gone horribly wrong, and now he didn't know what was real and what wasn't. But one thing was clear, the timeline had fractured, and his mother's existence was somehow at the center of it all. If she was truly in danger, if her existence was being erased. Albert clenched his fists, determination replacing his fear. He had to fix this. He had to find her and set things right. But to do that, he would have to venture into the fractured timeline, to confront whatever horrors awaited him in the shadows of time. And he knew, deep down, that the price of failure would be more than he could bear. Albert stood in the ruined lab, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. The vision of his mother haunted him, her desperate plea echoing in his ears. He knew that the fracture in time had placed her in unimaginable danger, and that he was the only one who could save her. But where had she gone? What had the flux core done to her, to the timeline? The air around him felt thick, almost tangible, as if reality itself was struggling to hold together. The once familiar lab was now a twisted reflection of what it had been, with dark, distorted shadows lurking in the corners, as though something malevolent was watching him. Albert forced himself to move, his legs feeling like lead as he walked towards the remnants of the flux core. The machine was a smoldering wreck, its inner workings exposed and sparking. He reached out to touch it, but the metal was searing hot, and he quickly pulled his hand back. "Think, Albert, think," he muttered to himself, pacing around the lab. "There has to be a way to fix this." His eyes fell on a small terminal that had somehow survived the explosion. The screen flickered with static, but it still seemed to be functioning. He rushed over to it, his fingers flying across the keys as he tried to access the data logs. The screen displayed a chaotic mess of code and error messages, but through the confusion, one line of text caught his eye: temporal anomaly detected. Albert's heart skipped a beat. The experiment had indeed caused a temporal fracture, and the anomaly it had created was somehow connected to his mother. The implications were horrifying. If the timeline had been altered in such a way that his mother's existence was threatened, it meant that her past, present, and future were in danger of being erased. As he dug deeper into the logs, a horrifying realization dawned on him. The fracture had created multiple splinters in time alternate realities, each with its own version of events. And in one of these splinters, his mother had never existed. "No, no, no," Albert whispered, panic rising in his chest. This can't be happening. But the evidence was right in front of him. The timeline had been shattered, and his mother's existence was now spread thin across multiple realities, each one more unstable than the last. If he didn't act quickly, she would be lost forever, consumed by the void that the flux core had unleashed. Albert felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had to enter the fractured timeline, to navigate the splintered realities and find the one where his mother still existed. But how? The flux core was destroyed, and even if it wasn't, there was no guarantee it would take him where he needed to go. As he racked his brain for a solution, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker, more solid. He could feel them closing in on him, the air growing colder, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. Albert froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was tall, humanoid, but its features were distorted, as though it had been pulled from a nightmare. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Who are you?" Albert stammered, taking a step back. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him. When it spoke, its voice was a low, menacing whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "We are the remnants," it said. "The echoes of a shattered timeline. You have broken the chain, and now, you must pay the price." Albert's blood ran cold. This thing, whatever it was a manifestation of the fractured timeline, a twisted byproduct of his experiment. And it was coming for him. He turned to run, but the shadows moved faster. They swirled around him, forming a barrier that blocked his escape. The figure advanced, its glowing eyes locked on him. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "The void will consume you, just as it will consume her." Albert's mind raced, his survival instincts kicking in. He couldn't fight this thing head-on, not here, not now. He needed to find a way out, a way to fix the timeline before it was too late. In a desperate move, he lunged towards the terminal, his fingers flying over the keys as he accessed the emergency protocols. The screen flashed red, warning him of the dangers of proceeding, but he had no choice. With a final keystroke, he activated the temporal failsafe. The room shook violently, and Albert was thrown to the ground as the world around him distorted and twisted. The figure let out a furious scream as the failsafe activated, its form dissolving into the shadows. Albert's vision blurred, the edges of reality fraying as the temporal failsafe did its work. He could feel himself being pulled into the fracture, the splintered realities converging around him. He didn't know where he would end up, or if he would survive the journey, but it was his only chance to save his mother. As the darkness closed in, Albert clung to one thought: he had to find her. No matter what horrors awaited him in the fractured timeline, he would not stop until he brought her back. With a final, disorienting lurch, Albert was hurled into the abyss. Albert's consciousness swirled through the void, disoriented and untethered. The sensation of being pulled in every direction at once made it impossible to tell which way was up or down. Flashes of light and shadow bombarded his senses as he tumbled through the fractured timeline, each one offering a glimpse into a reality that wasn't his own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Albert felt solid ground beneath his feet. His body ached, his head spun, but he was alive. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and when the world came into focus, he found himself standing in a place that was both familiar and alien. It was the lab, or at least a version of it. The walls were the same, the equipment in the same places, but everything was subtly wrong. The colors were off, the angles slightly skewed, as if reality itself had been warped. Albert took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. The air was thick with a strange, buzzing energy that made his skin crawl. He had no idea where or when he was, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to find his mother. As he moved through the lab, his eyes caught sight of a large, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. It hadn't been there before, at least not in the version of the lab he knew. The mirror's surface was dark and cloudy, reflecting nothing but a deep, impenetrable blackness. Albert approached the mirror, a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. Something about it felt wrong, dangerous, as if it were more than just a piece of glass. He hesitated, but the pull of curiosity and desperation was too strong. Slowly, he reached out and touched the surface. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, a wave of cold washed over him, and the darkness within the mirror began to swirl. Albert tried to pull his hand back, but it was too late. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and his reflection began to twist and distort. A face emerged from the darkness, not his own, but his mother's. Her features were gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She reached out towards him, her expression one of desperate pleading. "Albert," she whispered, her voice distorted by the mirror. "Please, help me." Albert's heart clenched with fear and determination. "Mom. Where are you?" "I'm trapped," she replied, her voice breaking. In the labyrinth. "Please, you have to find me." The image flickered, the darkness in the mirror churning violently. Albert could feel the pull of the void, the fractured timeline trying to consume him, but he wouldn't let it. He had to save her, no matter what it took. "Where is the labyrinth?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Follow the echoes," she whispered, her voice fading. "They will lead you to me." With that, the mirror shattered, the pieces falling to the ground with a deafening crash. Albert stumbled back, his mind reeling. The image of his mother's haunted face was burned into his memory, her words echoing in his ears. "Follow the echoes," he repeated to himself, trying to make sense of it. But what did it mean? How could he follow echoes through a fractured timeline? As if in response to his thoughts, the air around him began to ripple, and he heard a faint, ghostly whisper. It was the same voice he had heard before, the one that had warned him, taunted him. But now, it was different, softer, more distant, like a memory. Albert turned in the direction of the whisper, his heart pounding. The air shimmered, and for a brief moment, he saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of his vision. The figure turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the darkness. Without thinking, Albert followed. The lab around him faded, the walls dissolving into mist as he stepped into the unknown. He was no longer in the lab, but in a vast, dark expanse, a place that felt endless and suffocating, like the void between worlds. The whisper came again, stronger this time, and Albert quickened his pace. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, shifting, as if he were walking on a living thing. Shadows moved around him, their forms shifting and changing, always just out of reach. He had no idea how long he walked, but time seemed meaningless here. Hours, days, minutes, they all bled together in the labyrinth of time. The only thing that mattered was the whisper, the faint echo of his mother's voice leading him deeper into the darkness. Finally, he reached a clearing, a place where the shadows parted, revealing a massive structure made of twisting, black stone. It was a fortress, a prison, its walls lined with ancient symbols that pulsed with a sickly green light. Albert's breath caught in his throat. This was the labyrinth, the place where his mother was trapped. He could feel the malevolent energy radiating from the fortress, the air thick with despair and suffering. But he had no choice. He had to go in. As he approached the entrance, the shadows around him began to shift, taking on more solid forms. Figures emerged from the darkness, distorted, nightmarish versions of people he once knew. They surrounded him, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. "Albert," they whispered in unison, their voices filled with malice. "You should not be here." Albert's heart raced, but he stood his ground. "I'm not leaving without her." The figures laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the labyrinth. "You cannot save her. You will only join her, in the void." Ignoring their taunts, Albert pushed forward, forcing his way through the shadows. The entrance to the labyrinth loomed before him, a gaping maw that seemed to swallow all light. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world around him shifted. The walls of the labyrinth twisted and contorted, creating an ever-changing maze that defied logic and reason. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath his feet felt like it was alive, pulsing with dark energy. Albert's mind reeled as he navigated the twisted corridors, his mother's voice the only thing guiding him. The labyrinth was a nightmare made real, a place where time had no meaning and reality itself was a lie. As he ventured deeper, the shadows grew more aggressive, their whispers turning into screams. The walls closed in around him, the maze shifting with every step, trying to trap him, to break him. But Albert refused to give in. He pressed on, driven by the need to save his mother, to set things right. He could feel her presence, growing stronger with each passing moment. She was close, so close. And then, finally, he saw her. She was standing at the center of the labyrinth, her back to him, her form bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. She looked frail, exhausted, as if the weight of the fractured timeline had drained the life from her. "Mom!" Albert called out, rushing towards her. She turned to face him, and for a moment, relief flooded through him. But then he saw her eyes empty, hollow, devoid of the warmth and love he had always known. "Albert," she whispered, her voice tinged with despair. "You shouldn't have come." Albert's heart sank. "I'm here to save you. We can fix this, we can make it right." But she shook her head, her expression one of deep sorrow. It's too late. The labyrinth, it's taken us both. Before Albert could respond, the ground beneath him shifted, and the walls of the labyrinth began to close in, the shadows converging on them. The air was filled with the sound of screams, his own, his mother's, and the countless souls trapped in the void. Albert reached out to her, but the shadows pulled him back, their cold, clammy hands dragging him down into the darkness. He fought against them, his heart pounding with desperation. "No," he screamed, his voice echoing through the labyrinth. "I won't lose you." But as the shadows swallowed him, the last thing he saw was his mother's face, twisted in agony, before the darkness claimed him. Albert moved deeper into the labyrinth, his every step echoing with the weight of the distorted reality around him. The walls seemed to close in, shifting and twisting with each passing second, as if the very fabric of time was trying to consume him. He could no longer tell where he was, or even when he was, only that he was getting closer to the heart of the paradox that had torn his life apart. The air grew colder as he descended further, the shadows around him thickening into something almost tangible. Albert could hear his mother's voice, faint and distant, calling out to him from the depths of the maze. But each time he tried to follow it, the path shifted, leading him deeper into the darkness. He felt a deep sense of dread as he turned a corner and found himself in a vast, open chamber. In the center stood a massive structure, a monolith of black stone covered in strange, glowing symbols. The symbols pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Albert's heart pounded in his chest. This was the core of the labyrinth, the place where the paradox was strongest. He could feel the power radiating from the monolith, a force that twisted reality around it, warping time and space. It was here that his mother was trapped, caught in the web of fractured timelines. He approached the monolith cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee from the unnatural power that surrounded him. But he couldn't leave, not without her. As he drew closer, he saw her, his mother, standing at the base of the monolith, her body flickering like a fading hologram. "Mom!" Albert called out, rushing towards her. But as he reached out to touch her, his hand passed through her form, as if she were made of mist. "Albert," her voice was weak, filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come. It's too late." "No!" Albert shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I can save you. We can fix this." But she shook her head, her expression one of deep despair. "The timeline, it's too fractured. We're both lost in it." Albert felt a wave of panic wash over him. He had come so far, fought so hard, only to find that his mother was slipping away from him, lost in the chaotic remnants of time. The symbols on the monolith began to glow brighter, their light intensifying as the air around them grew colder. Suddenly, the chamber was filled with a low, rumbling noise, and the ground beneath Albert's feet began to shake. He staggered back as cracks appeared in the floor, spreading outwards like the branches of a tree. From these cracks, dark tendrils of energy emerged, twisting and writhing as they reached out towards the monolith. Albert watched in horror as the tendrils wrapped around his mother's form, pulling her towards the monolith. She cried out in pain, her body flickering more violently as the energy consumed her. "No!" Albert screamed, rushing forward. He grabbed hold of her arm, trying to pull her away from the monolith, but the tendrils were too strong. They coiled around her, dragging her closer to the glowing symbols. "Albert, you have to stop it," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the rumbling of the chamber. "You have to reset the timeline." Albert's mind raced. The flux core, the device that had caused this nightmare, was the only thing that could reset the timeline. But it had been destroyed, hadn't it? He looked up at the monolith, realization dawning on him. The symbols, the energy, they were connected to the flux core. This monolith was a part of the machine, a fragment of the device that had broken time. "If I destroy it, I can save you," Albert whispered, his resolve hardening. But as he moved to act, the tendrils tightened their grip on his mother, pulling her completely into the monolith. Her scream echoed through the chamber, a sound of pure agony that tore at Albert's soul. He watched in helpless horror as her form was absorbed into the monolith, her voice fading into silence. "No!" Albert fell to his knees, his hands trembling. The room around him began to collapse, the walls crumbling as the timeline unraveled further. But he couldn't give up, not now, not when he was so close. With renewed determination, Albert rose to his feet and ran towards the monolith. He reached out and touched one of the glowing symbols, feeling the cold, unnatural energy coursing through his body. The pain was intense, but he didn't let go. He focused all his willpower on the monolith, pouring his energy into the symbol. The monolith began to shake violently, the symbols flickering as cracks appeared in the stone. The tendrils of energy recoiled, their grip on the timeline weakening. Albert could feel the timeline trying to repair itself, the fractures beginning to close. But the process was slow, agonizingly slow. Albert gritted his teeth, pushing harder, forcing the monolith to bend to his will. He could feel his strength waning, his body weakening, but he couldn't stop, not until the timeline was restored, not until his mother was safe. The monolith cracked further, pieces of stone falling away as the energy inside it began to dissipate. The chamber around him trembled, the walls threatening to collapse in on themselves. But Albert held on, even as his vision blurred and his body screamed in pain. Finally, with one last surge of power, the monolith shattered, the symbols extinguishing as the energy within it was released. The chamber was engulfed in a blinding light, and Albert was thrown back, the force of the explosion sending him crashing to the ground. As the light faded, Albert lay on the cold stone floor, his body battered and broken. The chamber was silent, the monolith reduced to rubble. He struggled to his feet, his mind foggy, but he had to know, had he succeeded? Had he reset the timeline? He looked around, but the chamber was empty. There was no sign of his mother, no sign of the tendrils or the energy. Just silence. Albert's heart sank. Had he been too late? Had he failed? But then, in the distance, he heard it, a faint, familiar voice, calling out to him. Albert. He turned towards the sound, hope surging in his chest. It was her, it was his mother. He had done it. He had saved her. But as he took a step forward, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell into the darkness, his mother's voice fading into the void. Albert felt himself tumbling through the void, the darkness swallowing him whole. The sensation was disorienting, as if he were caught between realities, his body and mind stretched thin across the fractured timeline. But through the chaos, one thought kept him anchored: he had to find his mother. He landed hard on a cold, uneven surface, the impact jolting him back to awareness. Groaning, Albert pushed himself up, his muscles aching with exhaustion. He was in a new place, another distorted version of the lab, but this one felt different. The air was thick with tension, the shadows deeper, more oppressive. Albert looked around, his heart racing. The lab was a ruin, much like the others he had seen, but this time, the flux core was intact. It stood at the center of the room, its once pulsing blue light now a dull, flickering glow. The machine hummed weakly, as if struggling to maintain its grip on reality. His breath caught in his throat as he saw her, his mother, lying on the floor near the flux core. She was unconscious, her body flickering in and out of existence like a fading ghost. Albert rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he gently shook her. "Mom, please, wake up," he whispered, his voice thick with fear. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, but then her eyes locked onto his, and a weak smile crossed her lips. "Albert, you found me," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Tears welled up in his eyes as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm here. I'm going to get us out of this. I promise." But as he held her, he could feel the instability of the timeline pressing in on them. The lab flickered, the walls warping and distorting as reality threatened to collapse. The flux core, the source of all this chaos, was failing, and with it, their last chance to set things right. Albert helped his mother to her feet, supporting her as she swayed unsteadily. "We have to reset the timeline," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We have to use the flux core to undo everything, to put things back the way they were." She nodded weakly, leaning on him for support. "But, can it be done? The timeline is so fractured." Albert's jaw clenched. "It has to be done. If we don't, everyone will be lost. He led her to the control panel, his mind racing as he studied the readouts. The flux core was critically damaged, its power reserves nearly depleted. There was only enough energy left for one final attempt, a last, desperate bid to reset the timeline. His hands shook as he entered the commands, each keystroke echoing like a death knell in the silent lab. The flux core responded sluggishly, its systems groaning under the strain. The room around them flickered again, the walls bending inward as the fabric of reality began to tear. Albert felt a surge of panic, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had to do this, there was no other choice. As he initiated the reset sequence, the flux core roared to life, its blue light flaring brightly for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The energy surged through the room, filling the lab with an intense, blinding light. Albert shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as the ground trembled beneath him. The air was thick with static, the sound of crackling electricity filling his ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light faded, and the lab was plunged into silence. Albert blinked, his vision slowly adjusting to the dim light. The flux core was still, its power completely drained. The lab around him was no longer warped or twisted, instead, it was eerily still, as if frozen in time. He turned to his mother, who was standing beside him, her expression one of weary relief. She looked solid now, no longer flickering like a ghost. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice trembling. Albert wasn't sure. The lab looked different, but he couldn't tell if the timeline had been fully restored. Everything seemed quiet, too quiet. He moved towards the door, his mother following closely behind. As they stepped into the hallway, Albert felt a strange sense of unease. The corridors were empty, the lights dimmed. There was no sign of the chaos that had consumed the lab earlier, but there was also no sign of life. They made their way through the facility, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Every room they passed was empty, every corridor deserted. It was as if they were the only two people left in the world. "Where is everyone?" his mother whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Albert didn't have an answer. The reset should have restored everything to the way it was, but something was wrong. The timeline felt incomplete, as if pieces were missing. Finally, they reached the exit and stepped outside. The sight that greeted them was both familiar and horrifying. The world was still frozen in time. The sky was a dull, featureless gray, and the landscape around them was devoid of color. Trees stood motionless, their leaves suspended in midair. There was no wind, no sound, no movement. It was as if the reset had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Time had been reset, but it had also been stopped. Albert's heart sank. They had succeeded in stopping the collapse of the timeline, but in doing so, they had trapped themselves in a world where time no longer flowed. The world around them was a prison, a purgatory where nothing would ever change. His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, unspeakable sorrow. "Albert, what have we done?" Albert had no answer. He could only stare out at the frozen world, his mind reeling with the implications. They were trapped in a world that would never move forward, never grow, never change. A world without time. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Albert felt a crushing despair. They had saved the timeline, but they had lost everything in the process. As he stood there, staring out at the frozen landscape, a single tear slid down his cheek. The cost of resetting the timeline had been too high. And now, they would have to live with the consequences forever.